By April 20, 1945, I was at the ZixTAC headquarters in a Nazi army barracks at Brunswick. It was a fair-sized town with the natives moved out of our area that we surrounded by barbed wire. It had nice houses, and unlike the houses we had seen crossing war-torn France and Belgium, many of them were undamaged. The barracks were better than living in tents in the mud, but the comfort of the billets was marred by a shortage of food that made poorer staples more palatable. TAC business was slow. Higher-ups evidently considered the war practically over, and they hadn't been pelting us with papers, requesting info in triplicate. My billet was in a row of apartment houses across from the barracks that had been quarters for Nazi officers and their families. They had pulled out so fast we had to clear away their meal dishes, among other litter. Thousands of Russians captured by the Germans to be workers were moving around and looting items of luxury and everything else. We had to post guards to keep the Russians from hauling off our stuff and equipment after we moved into the barracks and quarters. One day one of the wives who used to live in the quarters came back and asked to put a note on the front door of her former home to tell her husband where to find her when he returned. She didn't tell us how she thought he might be able to just walk into the Yuzov's ZixTAC headquarters and read her note. But she was concerned that if he did, we might shoot a Nazi officer wandering around our quarters. We never saw him. I found million-mark notes, German money, being passed around. The notes were worthless, even for the Germans. They were printed during inflation after World War I and hadn't been used for 20 years. However, suddenly there were a lot of them around. Apparently, Le Bosch planned to make somebody redeem those notes at post-World War I prices. That is, of course, after they won the war. I stopped sending packages home. There was nothing left to buy to send home, and the army was checking outgoing packages for illegally looted items. AAF captures Volkenroad. In April 1945, the 1st Infantry Division accidentally stumbled on a large research facility intact hidden in a forest just a few miles from our barracks at Brunswick. By luck, the division had captured one of the top targets of the AAF's Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe Scientific Technology. Hermann Göring's Aeronautical Lab, the most advanced in the world, where the Germans did experiments and dreamed up the V-2 rocket. The Germans called the facility Volkenroad. Our TAC was aware that the AAF had teams fanned out behind advancing U.S. forces, searching for that and other facilities under orders from General Spatz, the USAF commander. Unbeknownst to us, for lack of posting enough infantry guards, the captured Volkenroad was looted and damaged before the AAF team could get to it, unfortunately, by GIs as well as German civilians. I suspected heads rolled for that. Ultimately, boxes of data and information from Volkenroad were shipped to Wright Airfield in Ohio. A peculiar story came out of that find. Civilian scientists working on a new German capability at the facility overrun by the 1st Division reported back to work a few days later, requesting permission to continue their research. They didn't care who they worked for, they just wanted to complete their projects. As we now know, scientists, including Werner von Braun, came to America and advanced our aviation knowledge rapidly, from V-2 rockets to intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And Saturn V boosters for the Apollo moon program. Some of the Volkenroad scientists went to Russia. An anticlimactic end. War for the Allies slowed down. On April 25, American forces had cut through the Wehrmacht divisions and, by presidential order, halted at the Elbe River near Torgau, Germany. On the other side of the river were our Russian allies, meaning we had conquered the Nazis from the west while the Russians conquered them from the east, effectively cutting the fatherland in half. In early May, I was checking out a new airfield up near the front and saw several German airplanes of different types come in fast at treetop levels at dusk with their wheels up until the last minute to quickly land on our airfield. Propaganda had been airdropped on Germany for Luftwaffe pilots to surrender at Allied airfields by flying in slowly in daylight with their wheels down, land, and wait to be captured. One of the German pilots had his tennis racket and other valuables in the plane with him. I'm not sure what he thought, that he would be able to keep his stuff as a prisoner of war? But the capturing part of enemy pilots came second after all GIs handy souvenired the planes and persons. The German pilots wanted to surrender to Americans, not Russians, so I'm confident the souvenired pilot was still happier to be an American prisoner, even without his stuff. The night of May 7, 1945, the word was out that the next day the war would be declared officially passed away. By way of celebrating, GIs cut loose at midnight with volumes of their assorted side arms firing into the air, generally making it unsafe to be out and about. Unit COs raised hell. Victory in Europe, V-Day, May 8, 1945, was a strange day. It was much the same as any other day for the last week, with only routine activity and not much of that. There was no celebrating. For all practical purposes, the war had been over for a while. I spent the day reading regulations, catching up on them. The first really warm weather came with the end of the war, as early summers are inclined, but with nothing much to do. We had an officers' club available, but even it had no business above normal. A quiet end to war. For the first time since I came into the European theater, we officially went on a schedule that allowed for days off to relax. But it was too close to the war's end for that. My war had long periods of work and movement behind the lines with an in-theater of war urgency pricked by an edge of uncertainty and then bombing, strafing and firing on other people, Germans, who were eliminated, maiming or capturing Allies, my pilots, and destroying Allied equipment, my airplanes. It'll be hard to forget that. The 11th Armored Division, with Bill as G2, liberated the Mauthausen concentration camp in Upper Austria, on May 5, 1945 and then drove into Germany. Elements of the division were the first of the Third Army to meet the Soviet Red Army on May 8, VE Day. A couple of days later, Bill reported he spent an evening drinking with officers of the 1st Russian Division to make contact with the Allies. He drank too many vodka toasts, which he claimed he had to for the sake of international relations, and was summarily decorated with a Stalinguard's honor badge pinned to his right pocket flap. He said the badge later was quite a conversation starter among the Allies. Miscellaneous foreign workers celebrated their liberation at the expense of the Germans. By a week after the war ended, we saw literally thousands of non-German workers, Russians, French, etc., either living in camps or odd buildings and such or on the roads walking home. According to reports, they looted or neutralized Germans at every chance they got. American forces hired the foreign workers but kept them under guard to keep them from stealing any sort of commodity they could get their hands on. By the middle of May, our blackout restrictions had been lifted. It was an odd sight at night after the last year of darkness. None of the German towns around us lit up. Allied units could be spotted like bright stars in the night. GIs were lousy with rumors about the future that didn't seem to indicate reality, just a lack of anything else to do. The most accurate rumor, which we implemented, was a directive to start close-order drills to keep the men out of trouble. High-level orders came down about not mingling with the local citizens, meaning mostly girls. The best I could tell, it wouldn't take much more idle time for the GIs to pile up an impressive list of courts-martial. On May 24, 1945, I flew west over the Ruhr Valley from my station in Brunswick on my way to a redeployment processing camp in England via Paris. The Ruhr was the famed German industrial area that had been one of the AAF's pet projects since the start of the war. I had bombed it several times. By May, the valley looked like one long series of bomb craters. Even the open fields in the industrial sections were chopped to pieces. The redeployment camp was crowded with officers and soldiers awaiting orders with nothing to do. Some had been there for weeks. I saw a large number of long faces. In early June, I left the European theater on a war-weary B-24 bomber in England bound for Boston, Massachusetts, by way of Iceland and Goose Bay, Labrador. I spent the entire trip trying to sleep while stuffed into 2 sleeping bags to keep from freezing. From Boston, I checked in with the Army and then made my way down the coast to Avon Park in Florida to my family, arriving June 17. I got reacquainted with my beautiful wife, Caroline, and our 3-year-old daughter, Caroline, the gremlin, a charming, chatty miniature of my wife. For the first time, I met my 11-month-old daughter, Patty, leaning out from behind her mother, tightly gripping the back of Caroline's skirt with one fist, and peering at me with big eyes, the thumb of her other hand stuffed in her mouth. Little did I know that Patty and I would begin collaborating on these memoirs 44 years later. Post Note 1. The Slayden brothers, one each in the Navy, Army, and Army Air Forces in World War II, had their first reunion after the war at a massive Navy Day celebration in Savannah, Georgia, on October 27, 1945. Commander Al, the oldest, a destroyer escort division commander, protecting American convoys crossing the Atlantic from submarines, CO of the USS George K. Mackenzie, DD-836, had just docked his ship. Lieutenant Colonel Bill had arrived back in America in August as the former G-2 of the 11th Armored Division, 3rd Army, and the youngest, Lieutenant Colonel Van, former CO of the 36th Fighter Group, 9 TAC, had redeployed in June. All three were alive and well. All had served the war effort honorably and attained the rank equivalent of lieutenant colonel. All were awarded Bronze Stars, or Air Medals, for their service. So they celebrated enthusiastically. The next morning, they made a pact to never recount to their families what happened on that night of partying with their wives and Bill's soon-to-be wife. When asked, they just rolled their eyes. Years later, a report leaked out of one of them that might be the reason for their hesitancy to talk. Of course, alcohol was involved, and they didn't sleep a wink that night. It was something about being tipsy at AL's table close to the admirals at the Navy Day celebration for dinner on shipboard when, slowly, one at a time, all 6 of them began crawling around under their table, trying to find a hearing aid dropped by one of AL's friends, who also was tipsy and under the table with them. Suddenly, they realized the room was quiet and people were staring. And that was the beginning of the night. No doubt the wives and girlfriend were the only reason the Slayden brothers returned safely to the hotel the next day. The brothers reported epic hangovers. Post Note 2. An honor guard from the 101st Air Assault Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 45 miles away, snapped to attention crisply, fired an 18-gun salute, and played taps for Colonel Philip Van Hatten Slayden, USAF, at his resting places in Wiley Cemetery, Waverly, Tennessee, on June 22, 1996. It was unusually hot that day, and sweat ran down the faces of those young soldiers in long-sleeve dress uniforms. They knew that Van Slayden's 36th Fighter Group supported their 101st Division at Bastogne, Belgium, in World War II, and their exceptional military bearing and professionalism honored him. Colonel Philip Van Hatten Slayden, 1913–1996, participated in the World War II campaigns in northern France, Belgium, and the Rhineland and commanded the 36th Fighter Group, P-47 Thunderbolts, 9th Air Force. He stayed on in the Air Force, serving, among other assignments, at the Pentagon, in the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. As an associate professor teaching military history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, U.S. Chief Advisor to rehabilitate the Republic of Korea Air Force after the Korean War, Inspector General of the 9th Air Force at Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina, and as commander of the 4,504th Tactical Missile Wing in Orlando, Florida. From first flying a PT-3 bi-wing, kite-like aircraft without brakes in 1937 to establishing the Air Forces, and America's first intercontinental ballistic missile school in 1959 while commanding the 4,504th Wing, he contributed to the most advanced and powerful Air Force in history. Always a country boy, Van Slayden retired to his hometown, Waverly, Tennessee, on May 31, 1962 as a command pilot, having earned an Air Medal with 6 oak leaf clusters, 3 Air Medals for 33 combat sorties in World War II. In Waverly, he was a gentleman farmer, ran the Slayden Lumber and Construction Company, and managed Slayden Brothers properties in the area. Patricia Slayden Hollis, daughter of Van Slayden and editor/collaborator of these memoirs, was the editor of the U.S. Army's and Marine Corps' professional journal, Field Artillery, for 20 years at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, before retiring in 2007. She interviewed for publication more than 80 senior leaders, including division and corps commanders returning from combat in Bosnia, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq, plus several junior enlisted veterans for their perspectives, a sergeant major of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Army, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. She holds a B.A. from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, 1966, and an M.A. from George Washington University, 1980, Washington, D.C. M.S. Hollis was an associate professor of English for Park College in Parkville, Missouri, and an award-winning news reporter. She received the 1996 Cady Award and statue from the Dallas Press Club for Best Magazine Interview with Lieutenant General John F. Sattler, U.S. Marine Commander of Joint and Coalition Forces in the Second Battle of Fallujah, Urban Operations in a New Kind of War, The Honorable, 1991, and Ancient, 1995. Orders of St. Barbara Medals for Service to the U.S. Field Artillery from Commanding Generals, CGs, of Fort Sill, and the Commander's Public Service Medal, 1982, from the CG of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.